The sky over the city was a bruised purple, weeping a relentless, cold rain that turned the narrow alleys into rivers of grime. Elena hurried through the labyrinth of District 13, her umbrella shaking against the violent gusts of wind. She was exhausted. Another double shift at the municipal hospital had left her bones aching and her mind numb. She took a shortcut through a dead-end alley, a place even the streetlights seemed afraid to illuminate. Suddenly, she stopped. The air changed. The clean smell of rain was choked out by something thick, metallic, and unmistakable. Blood. In the corner, slumped against a rusted dumpster, was a man. At first, she thought it was a corpse. His white shirt was translucent from the rain, clinging to a frame that was broad, powerful, and now, horribly broken. A dark, jagged stain was spreading across his side, blooming like a poisonous flower. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. As a nurse, her instinct said help. As a woman living in this city, her instinct screamed run. She took one tentative step forward. End quote. Hello? Can you hear me? End quote. In an instant, the end quote, corpse end quote, moved. With a speed that defied his injuries, a hand shot out and gripped her ankle. It was a grip of iron. In his other hand, a black semi-automatic pistol was leveled directly at her chest. End quote. One more step, end quote, he rasped, his voice sounding like broken glass, end quote, and it will be your last, end quote. Despite the rain, Elena could see his eyes. They weren't and oppose, the eyes of a dying man. They were the eyes of a predator, cold, gray, and dangerously sharp. But as he spoke, his arm trembled. The gun wavered. His head lolled back against the cold brick wall, his breath hitching in a pained wheeze. End quote. You and oppose, bleeding out, end quote, Elena said, her voice surprisingly steady despite her trembling hands. End quote. If you pull that trigger, the sound will bring the police. If you don't and oppose, you and oppose, LL be dead before the sun rises anyway, end quote. The man stared at her, a flicker of grim amusement crossing his pale, blood-streaked face. End quote. A brave little bird, end quote, he muttered. The gun clattered to the wet pavement. His grip on her ankle loosened, and his eyes rolled back, his body going limp as he succumbed to the darkness. Elena stood there for a heartbeat, the rain drenching her to the bone. She looked at the gun, then at the man. She knew who he was, or at least, what he represented. The tattoos peeking out from his sleeves spoke of a world of shadows and violence. She should call an ambulance. She should walk away. But instead, she knelt in the mud, pressed her fingers to his cold neck to find a thready pulse, and whispered to the wind, end quote, God help me, end quote. The weight of him was nearly unbearable. Elena had to drape his heavy arm over her shoulders, dragging his semi-conscious body up the 3 flights of creaking stairs to her cramped apartment. Every shadow in the hallway felt like a hitman waiting to finish the job. Once inside, she kicked the door shut and bolted every lock. She dragged him into the bathroom, the only place with bright fluorescent lighting and a tile floor she could scrub clean later. As she stripped away his soaked, blood-stained shirt, she gasped. His chest was a roadmap of scars, old bullet wounds, blade marks, and a massive, intricate tattoo of a silver wolf across his pectorals. But the fresh wound was the problem. A .45 caliber entry wound just below the ribs. End quote. Stay with me, end quote, she whispered, more to herself than him. She didn't and oppose, have morphine. She didn't and oppose, have an assistant. She only had her emergency medical kit, a bottle of high-proof bourbon, and a sewing needle. She poured the alcohol over her hands and then over his wound. The man's body jolted. His eyes flew open, burning with a primal, agonizing fire. He reached up, his large hand crushing her wrist in a vice-like grip. End quote. Do it, end quote, he hissed through gritted teeth, beads of sweat rolling down his forehead. End quote. No. Hospitals, end quote. End quote. Then Dawn and oppose, move, end quote, she commanded, her professional voice taking over. End quote. If I miss by a millimeter, you'll bleed out on my floor, and I am not cleaning that up, end quote. For the next 2 hours, the only sounds in the tiny apartment were the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock and the clink of metal instruments against a porcelain tray. Elena worked with a surgeon's precision. She could feel his intense gaze on her the entire time. He didn't and oppose. Pass out again. He watched her, silent and stoic, enduring a level of pain that would have broken any other man. Finally, she stitched the skin closed with neat, tight sutures. Her hands were covered in his blood, her forehead dripping with sweat. End quote. It and oppose. Done, end quote. She exhaled, leaning back against the cold tub. The man looked down at the bandage, then up at her. For a split second, the predator was gone. In his eyes was a strange, haunting curiosity. End quote. Why, end quote, he asked, his voice a low rumble. End quote. You know what I am, end quote. Elena looked at the silver wolf on his chest, then at her own trembling hands. End quote. I and oppose, M.A. nurse. I don and oppose, T. see a criminal. I see a patient, end quote. He didn't and oppose, T. respond. He simply closed his eyes, his breathing finally leveling out into a deep, heavy sleep. Elena watched him for a long time before exhaustion claimed her, and she fell asleep in the chair beside him, her hand accidentally resting near his. When she woke up at dawn, the apartment was eerily quiet. The bathroom door was open. The bed was neatly made, as if no one had ever been there. The only evidence was the faint scent of copper and expensive tobacco, and a heavy gold ring left on her kitchen table, engraved with a singular, sharp and oppose, V and oppose. Weeks turned into a month, and the memory of the silver wolf stranger began to feel like a fever dream. Elena returned to her routine at the hospital, but the world around her had subtly shifted. The city felt different, quieter, yet more watchful. The first sign that something was wrong, or perhaps, very right, happened on a Tuesday. For months, Elena had been harassed by her father's former business associates, low-level thugs who demanded she pay off debts she never signed for. They would wait for her by the hospital gates, hissing threats and pulling at her sleeves. That Tuesday, they were gone. She saw one of them across the street, but as soon as he caught sight of her, his face went pale. He didn't and oppose, T approach. Instead, he turned and ran as if he had seen a reaper. Then came the end quote, miracles, end quote. Her landlord, a man known for his cruelty and habit of overcharging her, suddenly showed up at her door with a bouquet of lilies and a stammering apology. He told her that her rent had been paid in full for the next 2 years by an end quote, anonymous benefactor, end quote. Everywhere she went, she felt a presence. A black sedan with tinted windows that always seemed to be 2 blocks behind her. A seat reserved for her at her favorite crowded cafe, even when there was a line out the door. The hostess would simply smile and say, end quote, your table is waiting, Miss Elena, end quote. One evening, Elena arrived home to find a single black rose pinned to her door. No note. No name. Just the velvet petals of a flower that shooed and oppose, T exist in nature. She stepped inside and froze. The air in her apartment was heavy with the scent of sandalwood and expensive cigars. End quote, you and oppose, relate, end quote, a voice rumbled from the darkness of her living room. Elena didn't and oppose, T scream. She reached for the light switch, her heart thundering. As the amber glow filled the room, she saw him. He was sitting in her armchair, looking far more dangerous than he had on her bathroom floor. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than her medical degree. His hair was slicked back, and his gray eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin flush. Dante Volkov. The man the newspapers called the end quote, silver wolf of the East Coast, end quote. End quote, you should and oppose, T be here, end quote, Elena whispered, clutching her bag to her chest. Dante stood up, moving with a fluid, predatory grace. He crossed the small room in 3 strides, stopping just inches from her. The height difference was overwhelming. He towered over her, a mountain of muscle and hidden scars. End quote, I told you not to lose the ring, Elena watched the familiar streets of her neighborhood fade away, replaced by the iron gates and winding drives of the elite suburbs. Dante sat beside her, a silhouette of frozen muscle, his eyes never leaving the window. He wasn't Apos, just a man, he was a fortress. They arrived at a sprawling estate hidden behind high stone walls and guarded by men with cold eyes and bulges under their jackets. Dante didn't Apos, wait for the valet. He opened the door himself and reached for Elena's hand. This is the Volkov estate, he said, leading her through massive oak doors into a hall of marble and gold. From this moment on, you do not leave without an escort. You do not answer the phone. You do not exist to the outside world, Elena pulled her hand back, her heels clicking sharply on the marble. You call this a debt repaid? This feels like a kidnapping, Dante, He turned, his shadow stretching long across the floor. The soft light of the chandelier caught the jagged scar on his neck, a reminder of the world he lived in. The men who shot me are called the Bravos. They are not businessmen, they are butchers. They know your name. They know your face. If I leave you in that apartment, they will use you to get to me. They will break you just to see if I bleed, He stepped closer, his presence commanding the very air she breathed. I am not keeping you here to punish you. I am keeping you here because you are the only thing in this world I cannot afford to lose, Elena felt a lump in her throat. I'm just a nurse, Dante. I'm nobody, You are the woman who looked at the devil and didn't Apos, blink, he countered, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. He signaled to a maid waiting in the shadows. Take her to the north suite. See that she has everything she needs. If she asks for the moon, find a way to bring it to her, As Elena was led away, she looked back. Dante was already surrounded by 3 men in suits, whispering about shipments, territories, and blood. She was in a palace, yes, but the walls were thick, and the air smelled of old money and fresh gunpowder. Her room was breathtaking, silk sheets, a balcony overlooking a private lake, and a closet filled with clothes that cost more than her annual salary. But as she stood on the balcony, watching the guards patrol the perimeter with dogs, she realized the truth. She had saved the wolf, and now, the wolf had claimed her for his pack. The question was she his guest, or his most prized possession? The evening air was thick with the scent of rain and expensive cologne. Elena stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror, draped in a gown of midnight blue silk that Dante had sent to her suite. It fit her like a second skin, elegant yet armor-like. The dawn is waiting, a guard rumbled from behind the heavy oak door. She was led downstairs to a dining hall that looked more like a throne room. A long mahogany table stretched across the center, lit by a dozen silver candelabras. At the head of the table sat Dante, looking regal and lethal in a black tuxedo. But he wasn't Apos, alone. To his left and right sat 4 men, the capos of the Volkov family. They were older, with faces like cracked leather and eyes that had seen too much death. As Elena entered, the room went bone-chillingly silent. The clink of silverware stopped. Gentlemen, Dante's voice cut through the tension like a blade. He didn't Apos, stand, but his presence commanded everyone else to remain still. This is Elena. The woman who saved my life, One of the men, a scarred veteran named Mikhail, narrowed his eyes. A nurse, Dante? You brought a civilian into the inner sanctum because of a medical favor? Dante leaned forward, the candlelight dancing in his gray eyes. He picked up a steak knife, his fingers tracing the edge. She didn't Apos, just perform a favor, Mikhail. She stared down my barrel and stitched me up while your men were still busy losing the shooters in the rain. She has more steel in her spine than half the soldiers on your payroll, Elena felt every gaze boring into her. She didn't Apos, cower. She walked to the vacant chair opposite Dante and sat down, her back straight. End quote. I didn't and oppose. Do it for the Volkov family, end quote, Elena said, her voice clear and steady. End quote. I did it for a man who was dying. In my world, life is sacred. I see that in your world, it's just a currency, end quote. A collective gasp whispered around the table. Mikhail's hand moved toward his jacket, but Dante slammed his palm onto the table. The sound was like a gunshot. End quote. Enough, end quote, Dante hissed. He looked at Elena, and for a fleeting second, his mask of cold stone crumbled. There was admiration there, and something darker, something hungrier. End quote. Tonight, we eat, end quote, Dante declared, his eyes locked on Elena. End quote. And tomorrow, the Bravos will realize that attacking what is mine is the last mistake they will ever make, end quote. The dinner was a slow torture of polite conversation laced with hidden threats. Elena realized that she wasn't an oppose, just a guest, she was a message. By placing her at his table, Dante was declaring to his world that she was under his absolute protection. As the wine flowed, the talk turned to end quote, business end quote, territories, shipments, and a traitor within their own ranks. Elena listened, her heart sinking. The man she had saved was not a hero, he was a king of a bloody empire. After the guests departed, Dante walked Elena back toward the grand staircase. The house was quiet now, save for the distant rain. End quote. You shouldn't oppose, have spoken to Mikhail like that, end quote, Dante said, though there was no anger in his voice. He stopped at the base of the stairs, turning to face her. End quote. Are you going to punish me, end quote, she asked, tilting her head. Dante stepped into her personal space, his hand reaching out to brush a stray lock of hair from her forehead. His touch was surprisingly gentle, a stark contrast to the violence he represented. End quote. I could never punish you, Elena, end quote, he whispered, his thumb grazing her jawline. End quote. But you need to understand. My world is a cage. And now that you and oppose, walked into it, the door is locked, end quote. He leaned in, his breath warm against her skin. End quote. Do you regret it? Saving me, end quote. Elena looked into those stormy gray eyes. She thought of her quiet life, her hospital shifts, and her empty apartment. Then she looked at the man who had turned the world upside down just to keep her safe. End quote. I don't and oppose, no yet, end quote, she breathed. The peace of the estate was shattered at 3 a.m. Elena was jolted awake not by a sound, but by a sudden, heavy silence. The rhythmic humming of the air conditioning had cut out, and the perimeter lights that usually bathed her balcony in a soft glow had vanished. The mansion was plunged into a suffocating, ink-black darkness. Seconds later, the muffled thump-thump-thump of suppressed gunfire echoed from the gardens below. Before Elena could even draw a breath to scream, her bedroom door kicked open. A dark figure lunged toward her. She scrambled back, her heart seizing, but a large, familiar hand clamped firmly over her mouth. The scent of sandalwood and gunpowder filled her senses. End quote. Dawn and oppose, make a sound, end quote. Dante's voice was a jagged whisper in her ear. He wasn't oppose, wearing his suit jacket anymore. He was in a black tactical vest, a heavy rifle slung over his shoulder and a pistol in his hand. Even in the dark, his eyes burned with a terrifying, predatory light. End quote. The Bravos, end quote, she managed to gasp as he pulled her out of bed. End quote. They bypassed the outer gates. They're inside the house, end quote, he replied, his voice devoid of emotion. He was in total combat mode. End quote. They aren't and oppose, here for the territory tonight. They're here for you. They think if they take you, I'll drop my guard, end quote. He led her toward a hidden panel in the walk-in closet. As they moved, a window in the hallway shattered. A grenade rolled across the carpet. Dante didn't and oppose, hesitate. He threw his body over Elena, pinning her to the floor just as a deafening crack shook the walls. A flashbang. White light seared Elena's vision, and a high-pitched ringing drowned out the world. "End quote, Elena," end quote, he said, turning to look at her one last time before the door opened. "End quote, I told you that you saved a devil. Tonight, you're going to see why they call me that," end quote. He kicked the door open and stepped into a hail of lead. Elena watched from the shadows, her eyes wide. This wasn't an oppose, ta fight, it was an execution. Dante moved like a ghost, using the marble counters and industrial appliances as cover, taking down 3 mercenaries before they could even pivot their weapons. But then, a fourth man, a giant of a human with a jagged scar across his throat, lunged at Dante from behind, swinging a heavy lead pipe. End quote, Dante. "Behind you," end quote, Elena screamed. The pipe shattered a glass cabinet inches from Dante's head. The 2 men crashed into a table of crystal glassware, a chaotic explosion of shards and blood. Dante was pinned, the giant's hands crushing his throat. Elena looked at the black knife in her hand. Her lungs felt like they were filled with ice. She had spent her life healing people. She had spent her life fighting to keep hearts beating. But as she saw the life draining from Dante's face, she realized that in this house, the only way to save a life was to take one. Elena's vision tunneled. The world narrowed down to the sight of Dante's fingers clawing at the giant's massive forearms, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. The mercenary was grinning, a guttural growl escaping his throat as he put his full weight into the choke. Elena didn't end oppose, T think. She didn't end oppose, T weigh the ethics of her nursing oath. She moved. She lunged out from the shadows of the doorway, her sneakers silent on the debris-strewn floor. She gripped the black knife with both hands, the way she had seen actors do in movies, but her grip was fueled by a raw, primal desperation. She slammed the blade into the mercenary's shoulder, right where the neck met the trapezius, a spot she knew from her anatomy books was crowded with nerves and arteries. The giant let out a roar of agony, his grip on Dante's throat loosening. He spun around, his eyes wide with shock that a little bird had dared to bite. He raised a massive fist to strike her, but that 1 second of distraction was all Dante needed. Dante lunged upward from the floor, a silver flash in his hand. With a precise, surgical movement, he drove his own blade into the man and oppose's heart. The giant froze, his breath hitching, before collapsing like a felled oak tree. Silence rushed back into the kitchen, broken only by the heavy, ragged breathing of the 2 survivors. Dante stood up slowly, rubbing his bruised neck. Blood, not his own, splattered his white shirt. He looked at the dead man, then at Elena. She was still standing there, her hands trembling so violently the black knife clattered to the floor. She looked at her palms, horrified, as if she could see the stain of the encounter through her skin. End quote, Elena, end quote, Dante said, his voice low and raspy. He stepped toward her, but she flinched, retreating until her back hit the cold steel of a refrigerator. End quote, I hurt him. I didn't end oppose, T. I've never, end quote. Dante didn't end oppose, T stop. He walked right into her space, ignoring the chaos still echoing in the distant parts of the house. He took her shaking hands in his, forcing her to look at him. His eyes weren't and oppose, T cold anymore, they were burning with a terrifying gratitude. End quote, you saved me, end quote, he whispered. End quote, again, end quote. End quote, I and oppose, M.A. nurse, Dante, end quote, she sobbed, her knees finally giving out. End quote, I and oppose, am supposed to fix people, not break them, end quote. Dante caught her before she hit the floor, pulling her into his chest. He held her tight, his heart thudding against her ear, a strong, steady beat that she had helped keep alive. He didn't and oppose, T offer empty platitudes. He didn't and oppose, T tell her it was okay. In his world, it wasn't and oppose, T okay, it was necessary. End quote, you didn't and oppose, T break a man, Elena, end quote, he said, his chin resting on her head. End quote, you killed a monster to save your life and mine. That is the only law that matters in this house." End quote. Outside, the sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, not the police, but the private security reinforcements Dante had summoned. The end quote, first strike end quote, was over, but as Elena leaned into the man who smelled of sandalwood and death, she realized the girl who walked into this mansion was gone. She had tasted the copper of the underworld, and for the first time, she understood why the Silver Wolf fought so hard. To protect the only light he had ever found in the dark. The aftermath of the attack was a blur of shadows and silver light. While the cleaning crews, men who moved like ghosts and spoke in whispers, erased the bloodstains from the marble, Dante led Elena to his private study. It was a room she had never entered, a sanctuary of dark mahogany, leather-bound books, and the faint, lingering scent of expensive bourbon. Elena sat on the edge of a velvet chair, wrapped in one of Dante's oversized cashmere sweaters. She felt small, fragile, and yet, there was a new, cold clarity in her chest. Dante stood by the window, staring out at the rain-soaked gardens where his men were still patrolling. He had changed into a fresh shirt, but he hadn't and Oppos, put on a tie or a jacket. He looked raw, unmasked. End quote, "You can't stay here," end quote, he said suddenly, his voice cracking the silence. Elena looked up, her heart skipping a beat. End quote, "What? You and Oppos, sending me away," end quote. End quote, "No," end quote, he turned, his expression pained. End quote, "I'm moving you. The estate is compromised. The Bravos didn't and Oppos, just stumble upon this place. They had help from the inside. There is a rat in my house, Elena. Until I find them and tear their throat out, nowhere is safe," end quote. He walked over to a small safe hidden behind a painting and pulled out a velvet box. He didn't and Oppos, hand it to her. He knelt at her feet, a gesture so humble it felt foreign coming from a man of his stature. He opened the box. Inside was a necklace, a delicate silver chain with a small, intricately carved pendant of a wolf's head, its eyes made of tiny, brilliant sapphires. End quote, "In my world, we Don and Oppos, use documents to prove ownership or loyalty," end quote, Dante said, his voice dropping to a low rumble. End quote, "We use marks," end quote. He reached out and fastened the chain around her neck. His fingers were cold, but his touch sent a jolt of electricity through her. The weight of the silver felt heavy against her collarbone, a tether to a man who ruled by fear. End quote, "This is the mark of the Volkov," end quote, he whispered, his face inches from hers. End quote, "Anyone who sees this will know that to touch a single hair on your head is to declare war on me. It is not just a gift, Elena. It is a warning to the world," end quote. Elena touched the cool metal of the wolf. End quote, "And what is it to me, Dante? A badge? Or a leash?" end quote. Dante's eyes darkened, a flash of something possessive and primal swirling in the gray. He leaned in, his lips inches from hers, the tension between them pulling like a tide. End quote, "It's a promise," end quote, he breathed. End quote, "That as long as I draw breath, you will never be alone in the dark again," end quote. Before she could answer, his phone buzzed on the desk, a harsh, digital intrusion. Dante stood up, the wall of stone slamming back into place over his features. He answered the call, his voice turning into ice as he spoke in rapid-fire Russian. Elena watched him, realizing that the end quote, repayment end quote, had evolved. It wasn't an Oppos, about a hospital bill or a rent check anymore. She had saved his life, and in return, he was weaving her into the very fabric of his empire. She wasn't an Oppos, just his nurse. She wasn't an Oppos, just his guest. She was becoming the only weakness a king couldn't and Oppos, afford to have, and his enemies knew it. The safe house was a fortress of glass and steel perched on a cliff overlooking the Atlantic. It was a cold, beautiful prison. For 3 days, Dante was gone. Elena spent her hours watching the gray waves crash against the rocks, the silver wolf pendant feeling like a lead weight against her skin. On the 4th night, the heavy iron doors groaned open. Dante walked in, but he wasn't the man who had left. He was disheveled, his jaw shadowed with stubble, and his knuckles were bruised and split. End quote. Dante reached out, his bruised fingers gripping her chin, forcing her to look into the storm in his eyes. End quote. He thought you were my weakness. He told the bravos that if they took you, the silver wolf would crawl on his knees. End quote. End quote. Did you kill him? End quote. Elena whispered, her heart hammering. Dante's thumb brushed her lower lip, his gaze dropping to the silver necklace he had given her. End quote. I did what had to be done to ensure you are never hunted again. But the bravos, they aren't and oppose, T finished. They've called in a contract. A professional from overseas. Someone who doesn't and oppose, T care about and oppose, codes and oppose, or and oppose, families and oppose, end quote. He leaned his forehead against hers, his eyes closing for a brief moment of vulnerability. End quote. I am the king of this city, Elena. I can move mountains, I can burn streets, I can erase men from history. But when I look at you, I realize I am terrified. For the first time in my life, I have something I and oppose, am afraid to lose. End quote. Elena reached up, covering his bruised hand with hers. End quote. You didn't and oppose, T grow soft, Dante. You grew human. That's what they're actually afraid of. End quote. Dante pulled back, a grim, determined smile touching his lips. End quote. Then I will show them how a human protects what he loves. Tomorrow, we stop hiding. Tomorrow, I end the bravos once and for all. End quote. He leaned in, kissing her, not with the gentleness of before, but with a desperate, hungry intensity that spoke of a man standing on the edge of a war he intended to win. The counterattack didn't and oppose, T happen in a dark alley or a shipping yard. Dante chose the most public, most prestigious stage in the city, the annual winter gala at the Grand Opera House. It was a move of pure arrogance, a declaration that he feared no one, not even under the bright lights of high society. End quote. If we stay in the shadows, they will keep hunting us. End quote. Dante said as he helped Elena into a dress of shimmering black lace. End quote. But tonight, the world will see that the silver wolf does not hide. End quote. Elena felt like a ghost draped in diamonds. She wore the sapphire wolf necklace over her heart, a silent warning to the vultures in the room. As they entered the ballroom, the music seemed to falter. Hundreds of eyes, politicians, judges, and rival bosses, turned toward them. Dante walked with his head high, his hand possessing her waist, his gaze sweeping the room like a commander surveying a battlefield. In the center of the room stood Marco Bravo, the youngest and most volatile of the Bravo brothers. He was surrounded by his own guards, sipping champagne with a smirk that didn't and oppose, T reach his eyes. End quote. Dante, end quote, Marco called out, his voice cutting through the orchestra. End quote. I heard you had a pest problem at the estate. So sorry to hear about the mess. End quote. The room went cold. Dante didn't and oppose, T stop until he was standing face to face with Marco. The tension was a physical weight, a wire pulled so tight it was screaming to snap. End quote. The mess has been cleared, Marco. End quote. Dante replied, his voice a calm, deadly silk. End quote. The rat is dead. And now, I'm here to settle the rest of the bill. End quote. End quote. Is that so? End quote. Marco glanced at Elena, his eyes lingering on her neck. End quote. And who is this? The famous nurse? She's a beautiful little thing. It's a shame how fragile human life can be. End quote. Dante didn't and oppose, T flinch, but his grip on Elena's waist tightened just enough for her to feel the dormant power in his muscles. End quote. She is the woman who saved my life. And she is the reason you won and oppose, T be leaving this hall tonight, Marco. End quote. Before Marco could respond, the lights flickered. It was a signal. Dante leaned into Elena's ear, his voice a warm ghost of a whisper. End quote. Stay behind me. Don and oppose, T look away. End quote. Suddenly, the music changed to a low, heavy waltz. Dante pulled Elena into the center of the floor. It was a dance of war. As they moved, Elena noticed his men she recognized from the estate, silently moving to block the exits. The Bravos were being boxed in, and they didn't and oppose even realize it yet. End quote. Dante, what are you doing? End quote, Elena whispered, her heart racing as they twirled past Marco's guards. End quote, I'm showing them the difference between a gangster and a king, end quote, Dante said. As the waltz reached its crescendo, Dante spun Elena one last time. In that split second of movement, he reached into his jacket. A silver flash. A muffled thud. Marco Bravo gasped, his glass of champagne shattering on the floor. He looked down at his chest, where a small, red bloom was spreading across his white silk shirt. Dante had used a needle-thin blade, a weapon of silence and precision. The ballroom erupted into chaos. Shouts and screams filled the air as the elite scrambled for the doors. But the Volkov soldiers were already there. It wasn't and oppose a massacre, it was a purge. Dante didn't and oppose look at the body falling behind him. He didn't and oppose look at the blood on the floor. He kept his eyes locked on Elena's, his face a mask of terrifying, absolute devotion. End quote, it's over, end quote, he said, pulling her through the side exit as his men finished the work. End quote, the Bravos are gone. The city is ours, end quote. Outside, the snow began to fall, white and pure, covering the black pavement. Dante led her to the waiting car, but before they got in, he stopped. He took her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the line of her jaw. End quote, you saved me in the rain, Elena. And tonight, I saved the world for you, end quote. Elena looked at the man she had rescued from death, realizing that she had not just saved a life, she had changed the fate of a city. She wasn't and oppose the nurse from the alley anymore. She was the anchor for a man who had forgotten how to be human. End quote, what happens now, end quote, she asked. Dante kissed her forehead, a promise of a future that was no longer lived in the shadows. End quote, now, we live, end quote. The weeks following the Grand Opera House purge were the quietest Elena had ever known, yet the air felt charged with a different kind of energy. The war was over. The Bravo name had been erased from the city and Oppo's ledgers, and the and quote, Silver Wolf and quote, now stood alone at the summit. Dante did not return to the dark, windowless safe houses. Instead, he bought a villa on the coast, a place where the walls were made of glass and the only shadows were those cast by the towering pines. One evening, Elena found him standing on the deck, looking out at the horizon where the dark sea met the starlit sky. He was and oppose wearing a gun. For the first time since she had met him, his posture was relaxed, his shoulders unburdened. End quote, I've made a decision, end quote, he said as she approached. He turned to her, the moonlight catching the sapphire wolf around her neck. End quote, the Volkov family is transitioning. No more street wars. No more blood money. We are moving into legitimate shipping and global tech. I'm cleaning the slate, Elena, end quote. Elena leaned against the railing beside him. End quote, you're doing this for the city, end quote. Dante reached out, taking her hand and bringing it to his lips. End quote, I'm doing it so that when our children look at me, they dawn and oppose see the scars you had to stitch in the dark. I want to be the man you believed I could be that night in the alley, end quote. He led her inside to the grand study, where a single envelope sat on the desk. Elena opened it and gasped. It was a deed to a new medical clinic in the heart of the city, a state-of-the-art facility dedicated to treating those the city had forgotten. End quote, it's yours, end quote, Dante whispered. End quote, you spent your life saving people like me. Now, you can save the people who truly deserve it. This is my true repayment, Elena. Not a ring, not a necklace, but a future where you never have to pick up a knife again, end quote. Elena felt tears prick her eyes. She had saved a monster, and in return, he had built her a cathedral of healing. She realized then that their bond was and oppose forged in blood, but in the choice to be better. End quote, I have one more gift, end quote, Dante said, his voice dropping to that familiar, husky rumble. He stepped back and reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. Dante had kept his promise. He had dismantled the machinery of violence, piece by piece, turning a criminal empire into a pillar of the community. Elena stood in the garden of their coastal villa, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The Silver Wolf Clinic was now the leading trauma center in the state, and she was no longer just a nurse, she was a visionary. But here, in the quiet of her home, she was simply Elena. A pair of strong arms wrapped around her waist from behind, and the familiar scent of sandalwood and sea salt enveloped her. Dante leaned down, resting his chin on her shoulder. His face was older, with fine lines around his eyes, but the predatory coldness had been replaced by a deep, enduring warmth. The gala is tomorrow, Dante murmured into her ear. The city is honoring the clinic's 5-year anniversary. Are you ready for the spotlight? Elena turned in his arms, her hands sliding up to his chest, feeling the steady, strong heartbeat she had once fought so hard to save. Only if you and Apos, standing right next to me, Dante smiled, a real, effortless smile. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn object. It was the black knife Elena had used to save his life in the kitchen all those years ago. It had been cleaned and polished, but the marks of that night were still there. I keep this to remind me, Dante said, his voice a low rumble of devotion. It reminds me that even in the deepest darkness, there is a light that refuses to go out. You were that light for me, Elena. You didn't and Apos, just save my life. You gave me a soul, He tucked the knife away and pulled her closer. In the distance, the city lights began to twinkle, the same city that had once tried to swallow them both. Now, it was a place of hope. We were born in the shadows, Elena whispered, looking up at the first stars of the evening. But we found our way to the sun, Dante replied. As the camera pans back from the villa, showing the vast, peaceful ocean and the shimmering city in the distance, the narrator's voice returns for the final closing. Closing narration, they say that in the underworld, every debt is paid in blood. But Elena and Dante proved that some debts are too great for gold or steel. They are paid in loyalty, in sacrifice, and in a love that transformed a predator into a protector. The Silver Wolf still rules the city, but he no longer hunts. He guards the light he found in a rainy alley, a reminder that no one is ever truly lost as long as someone is brave enough to stay. A week after the gala, the dust had settled, but the silence felt heavy. Dante had retreated into his work, finalizing the legal transition of his assets, leaving Elena alone in the vast coastal villa. For the first time, she had time to think. She looked at her nursing scrubs, folded neatly in her suitcase. They represented a world of order, of shifts, of coffee in paper cups, and of a life where danger was a patient with a high fever, not a man with a sniper rifle. She decided to take a walk. For the first time, Dante allowed her to go to the local town, provided she was followed by 2 of his best men, who trailed her like shadows in gray suits. As she sat in a small, quiet park, her phone buzzed. It was her old head nurse from the city hospital. Elena, we heard you took a private leave. We need you back. There's a promotion waiting for you. Come home, home, Elena whispered. Suddenly, a figure sat on the bench beside her. It was Apos, one of her guards. It was an older woman, dressed in simple black, her face a map of grief. Elena recognized her from a photograph in Dante's study. It was Victor's widow, the wife of the traitor Dante had executed. You are the girl, the woman said, her voice trembling but not with anger, with exhaustion. The one who changed the wolf, Elena stayed silent, her heart pounding. My husband was a greedy man, the woman continued, looking at the playground where children played. But in this world, greed is a survival instinct. Dante didn't Apos, Just kill him, he erased him. That is the man you are with, Elena. A man who can erase a lifetime of friendship in a single night, end quote. End quote, he did it to protect us, end quote, Elena defended, though the words felt heavy in her mouth. End quote, protect you, yes, end quote, the woman turned to her, her eyes dark. End quote, but remember this, a wolf can be tamed, but he is still a wolf. One day, the world will demand his teeth again. Are you ready to be the one who sharpens them, end quote. The woman rose and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Elena sat frozen. The shadow of the underworld was and oppos, just about bullets, it was about the moral weight of being the end quote, queen end quote, to a king who dealt in death. That night, when Dante returned home, he found her standing on the balcony, the nursing scrubs in her hands. He stood in the doorway, his silhouette blocking the light. End quote, you and oppos, rethinking of going back, end quote, he said. It was and oppos, a question. Elena turned. End quote, I'm a healer, Dante. Today, I met a woman whose world was destroyed by you. How do I reconcile the man who buys me diamonds with the man who leaves widows in his wake, end quote. Dante walked to her, taking the fabric of the scrubs between his fingers. End quote, you don and oppos, You accept that I am both. I am the shield that keeps the monsters away from you, and sometimes, a shield has to be covered in blood to do its job, end quote. He looked her in the eyes, his gaze raw. End quote, if you want to go back to that hospital, to that life, I will let you. I will give you a new name, a new city, and you will never see a shadow again. But if you stay knowing that I am not a saint. I am just a man who loves you more than his own soul, end quote. He stepped back, leaving the choice hanging in the salt-misted air. Elena looked at the scrubs, then at the man who had burned an entire criminal organization to the ground just to keep her safe. She realized that end quote, home end quote, wasn't and oppos, a place or a job anymore. It was the man who stood in front of her, scars and all. She let the suitcase fall to the floor. She walked into his arms, burying her face in his chest. End quote, I'm not going anywhere, Dante. But you have to promise me, we build something better. We use this power to fix what was broken, end quote. Dante squeezed her tight, his eyes closing in relief. End quote, I promise, end quote. 25 years had passed. The city had transformed from a battlefield of warring families into a glittering metropolis of innovation. At the heart of it all stood the Volkov Vane International Medical Plaza, a testament to a love that had defied the laws of the underworld. Dante Volkov sat in his office, though it was no longer hidden in a basement or behind reinforced steel. It was a glass sanctuary at the top of the city and Oppo's tallest spire. His hair was now a distinguished silver, matching the wolf head that still sat on his desk, the original gold ring he had left for Elena all those years ago. The door opened, and a young man walked in. He had Dante's broad shoulders and sharp jaw, but he possessed Elena's compassionate, observant eyes. End quote, father, end quote, the young man said, setting a file on the desk. End quote, the foundation has cleared the funding for the new wings in the outer districts. Mother is already there, overseeing the staff, end quote. Dante looked at his son, Leo. End quote, and the other business, Leo? The families who still remember the old ways, end quote. Leo smiled, a calm, confident expression. End quote, they understand that the Volkovs Don and Oppos, deal in lead anymore. We deal in life. But they also know that the end Oppos, Silver Wolf and Oppos, still has his teeth. They respect the peace because you made it unbreakable, end quote. Dante nodded, a sense of profound pride washing over him. He had done the impossible, he had taken a name synonymous with death and turned it into a symbol of hope. Later that evening, Dante drove himself, no guards, no armored convoy, to the clinic. He found Elena in the gardens, sitting on a bench dedicated to the end quote, unknown healers, end quote. She was silver-haired now, her beauty having matured into a grace that radiated peace. End quote, you and Oppos, Relate, end quote, she teased as he sat beside her, echoing the words he had said to her in her tiny apartment decades ago. End quote, the city is a demand, but it wasn't and oppose. Until I met you that I realized the only power worth having is the power to protect the ones we love, end quote. As the stars began to poke through the twilight, the end quote, silver wolf end quote, and his nurse walked toward their car, leaving behind a legacy that would outlast the shadows of the past. The war was a memory. The love was eternal. Narrator, while Elena was living through the end quote, miracles end quote, of her rent being paid and the black roses appearing at her door, Dante Volkov was living in a hell of his own making. These are the fragments of the thoughts he never shared, until now. Dante's voice, internal monologue. The first thing I remember when I woke up on her bathroom floor was and oppose, the pain. It was the smell. Not the smell of gunpowder or the wet pavement of District 13, but the smell of lavender and antiseptic. I looked at her while she slept in that uncomfortable wooden chair. She looked so fragile, a pale flower growing in the middle of a war zone. I could have killed her right then. It would have been the end quote, safe end quote, thing to do. No witnesses. No trail. My finger brushed the trigger of my Glock, but then I saw her hands. Those hands were stained with my blood. Not because she wanted to take my life, but because she was obsessed with saving it. I left that morning before the sun could expose me. I went back to the high-rises and the smoke-filled boardrooms, but I left a piece of myself in that cramped apartment. My men thought I was focused on the bravos. They thought the coldness in my eyes was a thirst for revenge. They were only half right. I spent my nights in the back of a black sedan, parked 2 blocks away from her hospital. I watched her walk out of those gates, tired and slumped. I saw the thugs leaning on the lamp posts, waiting for her. They didn't and oppose, know that every time they looked at her, they were looking at their own graves. I didn't and oppose, want to just pay her debt. I wanted to own the world she walked in so that nothing could ever hurt her again. I sent the roses because I wanted her to know that something beautiful could still exist in the dark. But I am a cursed man. I knew that by protecting her, I was marking her. I was pulling her into the gravity of a black hole. Every time I saw her name on a report from my scouts, my heart did something it hadn't and oppose, done in 20 years. It beat with fear. I told myself I would stay away. I told myself a wolf doesn't and oppose, belong with a dove. But then the bravos found her address. That night, when I sat in her armchair waiting for her to come home, I wasn't and oppose, there as a king. I was there as a beggar. I was begging the universe to let her look at me one more time without horror in her eyes. She walked in, and the light hit her. She looked at me, and I saw it, the spark. She wasn't and oppose, afraid of the monster, she was curious about the man. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. Because for her, I would burn the city to the ground. And for her, I would eventually learn how to build it back up. Narrator, behind every great king is a shadow that does the work the world never sees. Meet Alexei, Dante's most trusted enforcer. While Dante was falling in love, Alexei was fighting a shadow war to keep that love alive. Alexei's perspective, my job is simple, I make problems disappear before the dawn even knows they exist. But Elena was a different kind of problem. She was a light bulb in a room full of moths, and my job was to swat the moths before they burned her. I remember the night of the third and quote, miracle, end quote, Dante had ordered me to clear out the scum harassing Elena's father. I didn't and oppose, just scare them. I sat them down and explained the new math of the city, touch the girl, and you don and oppose, just die, you cease to have ever existed. But there was one moth I couldn't and oppose, swat so easily. A mercenary known as and quote, the ghost end quote, hired by the remnants of the bravos. He didn't and oppose, use armies, he used a long-range rifle and patience. For 3 days, I lived on a rooftop across from Elena's clinic. I watched her through a scope, not out of malice, but out of duty. I saw her hand a sandwich to a homeless man. I saw her stay 2 hours late to hold the hand of a dying woman who had no family. I understood then why the Don was obsessed. In our world, everyone wants something from you. But this woman? She just wanted to give. On the fourth night, I saw a reflection on a building 3 blocks away. A lens flare. The ghost had found his perch. I didn't and oppose, called Dante. He was at dinner with her, finally smiling for the first time in a decade. I wooed and oppose, ruined that. I slipped through the shadows, moving like a phantom across the skylines. When I found the ghost, he was seconds away from pulling the trigger. The fight was silent. No guns. Just cold steel and the sound of the wind. When it was over, I wiped my blade and looked down at the street. I saw Dante leading Elena to his car. He looked happy. I stayed in the shadows, blood dripping from my knuckles, and I whispered to the night, and quote, "Stay in the light, little bird. I and oppose, LL take care of the dark," end quote. Narrator, years later, on the night before their wedding, Elena found Alexei standing by the garden gates. She knew he was the one who had kept the end quote, miracles end quote, happening. Elena walked up to the giant of a man, the one everyone else feared to look at. She didn't and oppose, say thank you for the protection. She knew that wasn't and oppose, what he wanted. End quote, Alexei, end quote, she said softly. End quote, does he know? Everything you did, end quote. Alexei didn't and oppose, look at her. He kept his eyes on the horizon. End quote, he knows what he needs to know, Mrs. Volkov. He knows you are safe. That is the only truth that matters to him, end quote. Elena reached out and placed a hand on his massive arm. End quote, you saved more than just my life. You saved his humanity by keeping mine intact, end quote. Alexei finally looked at her, a rare, grim respect in his eyes. End quote, just keep him human, Elena. The city can and oppose, handle another monster, end quote. Narrator, peace is a fragile thing in a city built on bone. 2 years after the fall of the Bravos, a new threat emerged, not from the streets, but from the ghosts of the past. They didn't and oppose, want the territory. They wanted the legacy. It was a quiet Tuesday at the villa. Elena was in the nursery, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of baby Leo's chest. The silver wolf pendant hung around her neck, reflecting the soft glow of the nightlight. For a moment, the world felt perfect. Then, the nursery monitor crackled. It wasn't and oppose, the sound of a baby stirring. It was the sound of a heavy boot stepping on broken glass. Elena froze. Her medical training kicked in, not the part that heals, but the part that stays calm under extreme pressure. She didn't and oppose, scream. She reached under the rocking chair and pulled out the hidden compartment Dante had insisted on installing. Inside was a localized panic button and a small, silver handgun she had prayed she would never touch. End quote, Dante, end quote, she whispered into the intercom. No answer. Only static. The attackers had jammed the frequencies. The nursery door creaked open. A man in a tactical mask stood there, his eyes cold and hollow. He didn't and oppose, look at Elena, he looked at the crib. End quote, the wolf's cub, end quote, the man rasped, raising a silenced pistol. End quote, a high price for a dead father, end quote. Elena stepped between the intruder and the crib, her hands steady despite the ice in her veins. End quote, you'll have to go through me first, end quote. The intruder laughed, a dry, soulless sound. End quote, you and oppose, Ria nurse, lady. You save lives. You don and oppose, take them, end quote. End quote, I do both for my family, end quote, Elena replied. Before the intruder could pull the trigger, the wall behind him exploded. Not from a bomb, but from the sheer force of Dante Volkov crashing through the Secret Service panel. He didn't and oppose, looked like the refined businessman Elena saw at dinner. He looked like the monster the city feared, a blur of shadow and raw, unbridled rage. He tackled the intruder, the two men crashing into the hallway. Elena didn't and oppose. Wait. She grabbed Leo, wrapped him in a thick blanket, and bolted for the reinforced safe room behind the library. But I will spend every second of my life making sure the shadows never reach this room again, end quote. That night, they didn't and oppose. Sleep. They sat together in the nursery, the king and his queen, watching over the sleeping prince. They realized that their love was and oppose. A fairy tale. It was a fortress. And every fortress requires a guard who is willing to become a monster so that the ones inside can remain human. Narrator: Dante had spent his life winning wars with bullets. But Elena knew that a kingdom held by force is a kingdom waiting to fall. To ensure her son's future, she decided to fight a war where the weapons were not guns, but teacups, whispers, and a terrifyingly sharp intellect. Without telling Dante, Elena sent out 4 invitations. They weren't and oppose. Sent to the bosses of the remaining syndicates. They were sent to their wives. The meeting took place in the neutral ground of the city and oppose, botanical gardens, under the glass dome of the orchid pavilion. Elena sat at the head of a circular table, dressed in a simple, sharp white suit. Across from her sat the women who controlled the hearts and ears of the most dangerous men in the country. End quote. You have a lot of nerve calling us here, Elena Volkov, end quote, said Sophia, the matriarch of the southern cartels. Her husband had lost 3 warehouses to Dante's purges. End quote. Your husband has spent years tearing down the world our families built, end quote. Elena didn't and oppose. Blink. She poured the tea with a hand that didn't and oppose. Shake. The hand of a nurse who had looked into the eyes of death 1,000 times. End quote. My husband tore down a world of chaos, end quote, Elena said, her voice like velvet-wrapped steel. End quote. A world where your sons are buried before they turn 25. A world where you spend every night wondering if the car engine starting outside is a bomb, end quote. She leaned forward, her sapphire wolf pendant catching the afternoon sun. End quote. I'm not here to talk about the past. I'm here to offer you a different future. Dante is moving into the light. He is building an empire of legitimate commerce, shipping, tech, and medicine. I am inviting your families to join us. Not as rivals, but as shareholders, end quote. End quote. And if we refuse, end quote, another woman hissed. Elena set her cup down with a soft clink. End quote. Then you continue to fight a war you cannot win. Dante is a wolf, but he is my wolf. If you push him back into the shadows, he will do what wolves do. He will feast until there is nothing left. But if you walk with us into the light, your children can go to university without bodyguards. They can have names that command respect, not fear, end quote. The silence in the pavilion was absolute. For the first time, these women saw what Dante saw, the strength that comes not from the ability to kill, but from the will to build. End quote. You and oppose. Ria nurse, end quote, Sophia whispered, looking at Elena with a new, dark respect. End quote. You and oppose. Ri trying to heal the whole city, end quote. End quote. I and oppose. Am trying to make sure my son never has to wash blood off his hands, end quote, Elena replied. By the time the sun set, the end quote, Treaty of the Orchids, end quote, was unofficially signed. Elena had done in one afternoon what Dante hadn't and oppose been able to do in a decade. She had secured a lasting peace by convincing the mothers of the underworld that life was more profitable than death. When she returned home that night, Dante was waiting in the hallway, looking suspicious. End quote. My scout said you met with the southern families today. Elena, that was dangerous, end quote. Elena walked past him, kissing his cheek and handing him her coat. End quote. It was and oppose. Dangerous, Dante. It was an appointment. And Don and oppose. Worry. I and oppose. V already handled the bill, end quote. Dante watched her walk up the stairs, a bewildered, proud smile spreading across his face. He realized then that he was and oppose. The only one in the house who knew how to conquer a city. Narrator: the story that began with a bloodstain in a dark alley ends with a celebration of light. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Dante and Elena renewed their vows on the cliffs overlooking the sea. The entire city seemed to be watching. There were no hidden guns today. No armored cars. Just a man, a woman, and the life they had built together. Dante stood at the altar, looking at his wife as she walked toward him. She still looked like the girl from the alley, but her eyes held the wisdom of a queen who had saved a king. End quote. I gave you a mark once, end quote, Dante said, his voice echoing over the waves, referring to the sapphire wolf. End quote. I told you it was a promise that you'd never be alone in the dark, end quote. He took her hand, his thumb tracing the wedding band. End quote. But the truth is, Elena, you were the one who brought the light. You taught me that the strongest man isn't and oppose, the one who can take a life, but the one who can find something worth living for, end quote. Elena looked at him, her heart full. End quote. You were my first patient, Dante. And I think you and Oppos, finally fully recovered, end quote. As they kissed, a flock of white birds was released into the sky, soaring over the city of Volkov. The camera pulls back, higher and higher, showing the clinics, the schools, and the peaceful streets. The end quote, Silver Wolf end quote, had found his home. The nurse had found her purpose. And the debt? The debt was finally, beautifully, paid in full.